Hi, friends. Today I am thrilled to be talking to the one and only Aileen Miracle about getting started with centers in elementary music. You can find Aileen's bio and read some about her background and see some of her resources for centers with the link in the show notes. Last thing, you can listen to our conversation with your podcast player wherever you get your podcasts, or you can jump over to YouTube to watch our conversation. And with that said, let's jump in. My name is Victoria Bowler, and this is episode 75 of Elemental Conversations. Aileen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
It is kind of a dream come true for me to have this conversation with you because you were one of the very early blogger podcast people. And I can remember in my mind where I was when I found your podcast like years ago. And I looked at it and I was like, there are podcasts for music people. Like, this is a total game changer. And I think it was like you and David Rao, and that was kind of it. And you have been leading the charge in music education for a long time. Why don't you tell us about how you continue to lead this charge in your new role, just to give people an update on your situation?
Sure. Thank you so much for your kind words. I'm glad the podcast and my blog were helpful. So I just finished my 24th year of teaching music. And over my career, I've taught everything from kindergarten through 7th grade, general music, as well as band, beginning band, orchestra, beginning orchestra, and choir. And I've loved every minute, but I am stepping into a new role as a unified arts curriculum supervisor. So in my district, this is a brand new role. We haven't had it before. And I will be overseeing all of the K-12 music, art, health, and PE teachers, as well as some other content areas at the middle school level, like world languages. And sorry for any background noise, that would be my puppy drinking water right now. World languages and like family and consumer sciences as well. So it's a big role and I'm really excited about it.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So you will still get to be, you can still wear your hat of elementary general music. You just get to add more hats on top of it.
Hopefully I'll, be able to still be in the music classroom, just not my own music classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really hoping that I'll still have time to teach, to be like a guest teacher, I guess. But then we'll also be helping other content areas as well.
Yeah, that is such a beautiful role for you, in my opinion, right? Because it takes all of the skills that you already have and it just applies them to other areas. And if we think about what we're talking about today, Aileen, which is centers, there is a lot of like probably the centers mentality in your brain, like how you're approaching this job, because you have like 37 different people doing 37 different things, but you're viewing all of them as like one umbrella, right?
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
I can see how the skills that make you so good at centers would also make you an incredible arts coordinator. I know all those teachers are very lucky to have you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so talk to me about centers, Aileen, and let's imagine that someone is saying, I hear Aileen talk about centers here and there, and she has this course, but I don't see how centers could work for elementary general music, the type of music stuff that we do. I can see it working for reading or for math or for history, but probably not for music. What are some of the benefits of centers that we might be missing out on?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people are afraid to try centers because it is different, right? And it is a little bit of a risk. But as far as benefits go, I think it feels to me much more student-centered when I do centers, and it allows students to have more choice and agency. And, especially if you're doing something like choice centers, which I can get to in a little bit, where students are choosing which centers they go to, they just have the ability to kind of regulate themselves and figure out what activity they want to do and when they want to switch, which is great. And then there's more time for one-on-one. So like if, let's say you're practicing recorders with students, in kind of that traditional model that I first started doing when I was first teaching is if you want to have students play the recorder, then they might be playing a song in front of everybody else, right? Which for our students with anxiety, that's a big ask. And on top of that, let's say you have 27 students in the class and you have one student playing a solo, then the other 26 students maybe are listening, or maybe it's time for them to, maybe they might have a hard time managing their behavior, I guess, right? It's easy for them to get distracted. So
Yeah.
with centers, it allows that one-on-one where you could listen to a student play the recorder or whatever it might be. And then all the other students are engaged with something else. Not all of the attention is on that one student. The other students are doing whatever else you've asked for them. So it's really a win-win. So yeah. And as far as like, I think why people have a hard time, oh my gosh, my dog is being really playful right now. It's like biting at me while I'm trying to talk. Sorry. So I think why teachers often struggle with doing centers, like I said, it's a big risk, maybe not a big risk, but it's definitely a risk, especially if you're afraid that maybe your administrator is going to walk into the room as you're trying something new. And I think in this day of Instagram, where everything looks perfect and curated, we almost expect ourselves to be perfect all the time. And that's just not reality. So if you can kind of get past that, like, this is going to be a little messy, and that's okay. And you're going to have to try some things out and see what works for you and your students. And that's okay too. If you can get past that, then I have seen so much growth with my students, so much engagement. They're so excited when we do centers, and especially when they're able to choose their own centers. So, and then they're able to practice concepts in several different ways. And maybe like if you have a limited set of instruments in your room, or you have limited technology, with centers, all of the students are able to play instruments that day, or all of the students are able to touch your technology, even if you only have, a smart board or an interactive whiteboard, and that's the only technology you have in your room. All of your students are able to use it because they're just working in small groups. So yeah, definitely lots of advantages. And I think overall too, that like, you can see a lot of growth, because with centers, the way I usually do it is we're focusing maybe just like on one concept. So because you're really focused just on that one concept, and in my typical lessons, I might be practicing a couple different concepts. I might have a rhythmic concept and a melodic concept, which I love that, lesson model. But with centers, having the focus just on one concept, I think is really helpful, especially when you can do assessment one-on-one. You can also provide intervention. That's another big benefit. I've pulled students aside to work with them one-on-one, especially when I've done some kind of, data beforehand or data tracking beforehand to see which students were struggling. And then I'm able to pull those students aside to work with them one-on-one to see where their breakdown of knowledge is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So much there, Aileen. One of the things I heard you say is if you're doing centers, you're probably going to be focusing on one concept. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. If we are wearing a Kodai hat where we're doing like maybe a prepare idea here and a practice idea here, you're recommending that we have one idea through the whole lesson, or at least like the time that we have students at centers. That way we can get as much info, we can kind of maximize the information that we're getting.
Yes, that's what I prefer. I have done centers with two different concepts before, and that works too. Or like, let's say you're practicing ukulele, maybe two of the centers are ukulele and two of them are famoso or something like that. Like there's really no like wrong or right as far as I'm concerned. Like you can kind of cater the centers and the approach however you want to. But what I found is having one concept to work on. I think it makes it easier to come up with centers when you're just focusing on one thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably easier to explain to students what they're supposed to do at each center as well when they're just focusing on one concept.
Yeah, and then we also think about, just to yes and that, like the amount of context switching that you would be asking of students, because it's one
That's
thing
true.
to say, like play this rhythm, now read this rhythm, now do some arrangement activity with this rhythm. But if we were to say, play this melody, now arrange this rhythm, now sing this melody, now blah, 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 and like we're trying to draw on students different aural contexts for all of it. That's kind of a lot. So I think that's
Yeah, that's true.
helpful.
That's a really good point.
I think that's helpful, Aileen, that you say that, even though I hear you say, like, you can make it as expansive as you want. But what you are saying is start with one thing at least, and then if you can see that your students are good with one concept expressed through these 7 different ways or whatever it is, then maybe you expand to a prepare idea and a practice idea, or a rhythmic idea and a melodic idea. But we don't have to go level 10 out of 10 when we start centers.
Yes, I would. Yeah, definitely start simple. And I think that's really something that made me hesitate when I first started centers. Like when I was in my first year of teaching, I was able to observe a veteran teacher and she was doing centers. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting and neat, but I never tried it. And then in my oldest daughter is now 19. When she was in kindergarten, she was a student at my school, and I was able to, her kindergarten classroom was like across the hall from me. So I was able to go over and visit every now and then. And I saw her
Mm.
kindergarten teacher doing centers with like the letter J or something. And I thought, oh, this is so cool. Like they're practicing the letter J in all these different ways. I wonder if I can do this in my own classroom. Uh, and I hesitated because I had Kodai training, which was wonderful and so transformative to my teaching. But I think I had it in my head like, oh, well, every lesson needs to look like this, right? Every lesson needs to be preparing or practicing a rhythmic concept, and every lesson needs to be preparing and practicing a melodic concept, unless you're doing like a presentation lesson or a make
Yep.
conscious lesson.
Yep.
And I just kind of had to give myself permission to try something new. And this is not something that I do every single lesson at all. It's maybe like, you know, 4 times a year. Or I was challenging myself this past year to do at least one centers lesson every quarter, if not two.
Mm.
So maybe like 4 to 8 times a year, I was doing centers with each grade level. And that's actually
Yeah.
not even how I started. When I first started, it was like I tried maybe 2 centers lessons in the year.
Yeah.
So you can kind of start with wherever you're comfortable and expand from there. But yeah, I think it's you kind of have to give yourself permission to just try something new and kind of see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's imagine, Aileen, that we have, let's take third grade. And let's say that we are rocking and rolling in third grade on, let's say, ta, di, mi, taka, di, or rhythm syllables of your choice. What are some of your go-to centers that you think are a little bit more on the manageable side for students?
Yeah. Were you saying, is it like a 2/16, 1/8? Is that what you're talking
Yes,
about?
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Yeah.
pick whatever
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, after doing centers for several years, I kind of came up with a formula that I thought worked well for brainstorming types of centers. So, if we're just talking about 4 centers, then I typically have one center that's instrument based, one that is assessment based, one that has to do with technology, and one that is an assessment or manipulatives. Maybe I
Okay.
just repeated myself,
Yeah.
manipulatives. So technology, manipulatives, instruments, assessment.
Yeah.
So if we go with that model, then maybe for Tadimi or Tikati or whatever you call it, if you're doing something that is instrument based, then maybe you have some rhythm cards out with that rhythm pattern. And this really could work for any
Yeah.
rhythmic concept that you're working on. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. My dog is not usually this playful ever, and he's like biting at me as I'm talking. So
He's
I
excited.
apologize for any background noise. I'm like, stop it. Okay, so instrument based, you might have a bunch of flashcards out on music stands, and then a bunch of non-pitch percussion for students to choose from, right? So maybe you just have like bins of hand drums and maracas and whatever else.
Mhm.
And then you have the students choose whatever instrument they want and then play those rhythm patterns on that non-pitch percussion. And then after they're done with all of those rhythm cards, then let's say they did a maraca first. They put down the maraca, they pick up a hand drum, and they play all of the rhythm patterns again. It's a really good physical practice of that rhythmic concept. So that could be the instruments station. And then let's say for assessment, maybe we'll start with technology. Maybe you have like a smartboard file or some kind of interactive file where the students are reading rhythm patterns from the screen. So I have made like all of these like koosh ball type activities where the students throw. It's really a squishy ball that I use.
Yeah.
I get mine from Target. They probably have them in plenty of other stores, but they're like little squishy balls, right? So they throw a squishy ball at the interactive whiteboard, which I know seems crazy that I'm telling you that you should have your students throw something at the interactive whiteboard, but it's like squishy, it's soft, so it doesn't really hurt it. It's just as hard as like tapping the screen. So maybe they throw something at the interactive whiteboard and then they read whatever pattern comes up, right? And I actually I can send you a link, Victoria, of like, I think I have this for, I want to say it's for Ta and TT, but it might be Ta, TT, and Russ. But I have like 4 centers that the listeners can get for free. And one of them is a file like this for that
Oh,
rhythmic.
awesome. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
put that in the show notes. Thank you. That's great.
Yeah. So they throw something at the screen and they read whatever comes up, and then they go back to the homepage, and the next kid in the line comes up and does the same thing. So that could be the technology. And then the assessment could be same idea, but they're reading the rhythm patterns one-on-one with the teacher.
Ah,
So they get in a line, the first person comes up, and they read the first pattern. So it might be like ta, ta, tickety, ta. And you're listening for, can they read it to a steady beat? Do they remember the names of the rhythm syllables, right? How much assistance do they need? And you could do a quick check. It could be like a 4, 3, 2, 1 kind of rubric, or it could be just like plus, check, minus,
yeah,
just
definitely.
a quick little assessment. Now, while the one student is reading the rhythm patterns to you, you could have the other students simply waiting. I've done that. Or you could have them do something else. Like I'm lucky enough that I've had iPad minis in my room, like 8 iPad minis. So maybe while the one student is reading rhythm patterns to you, the other students are playing on some kind of app. Like maybe they're playing in Chrome Music Lab, or I have an app called Keezy on my iPad. So maybe they're creating music in Keezy, or whatever that might be. It could be something completely unrelated to whatever, Tickety or whatever you're working on. It's just something for them to do while they're waiting, right? So that could be the assessment center. And then for manipulatives, maybe you have students using fruit manipulatives to create their own patterns. So like watermelon could be ticka ticka,
Sure.
and apple could be TT, and maybe for tickety or tadimi, it could be like a tangerine or something, right? So they're creating 4-beat patterns with fruit. They're saying it with the fruit names, and then they're saying it with rhythm syllables, and then they're creating a different pattern. Maybe they're working individually, maybe they're working in small groups, however you want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and any of these could be activities that they have done as a whole group. That does make it easier if you start with at least a couple of the centers as activities that they've done as a whole group. That way you can say, like, this is what we're doing at the center, like we did, in music class recently. So it's not like 4 completely brand new activities that they have to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love those buckets, Aileen, because then it's not like I notice probably very intentionally you have one station with instruments, right? How many stations? One station, right? And probably that would be in the place of your room that is going to be the least disruptive to all of the other students. So I think that's super smart of kind of managing the noise, which I know is a concern for a lot of people.
Yeah, that is definitely a concern with centers. You do have to be careful about where you put your instrument centers or anything with noise, because it can get rather noisy. I've been lucky that I've had a pretty large, spacious room, and I set it up but even if your room is smaller, I set up my centers kind of on the perimeter of the room, on the edge of the room. So I can kind of, walk around in the middle and look at everything on the perimeter.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to work well. But I think even if you have a smaller space, you just have to be mindful. And again, this is experimentation. You just kind of have to experiment with what works. I have found that having anything more, like, because sometimes I'll do more than 4 centers, or let's say I do 6 centers. I would not do more than 2 instrument centers,
Yeah.
because otherwise it gets noisy. Or if you're going to do more than that, like maybe they're not playing the whole time. Maybe they're doing a worksheet and then they're playing, right? So that way it's not super noisy. And then for students who have sensory issues, maybe it gets too loud for them. And I've had students come up to me and say it's just too loud. Again, because I have a big room, I have the benefit of being able to say, well, why don't you go over to this area of the room for that center? But I've also given students headphones
For sure.
just to block out the noise, which seems to be helpful.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. I love that. So, one of the very tactile things that you told us that we can do as we are implementing this, one of the things that we can do is have a center or two that students have already done as a class with you leading it. We've all done it in like our classroom ensemble, so to speak. And then we do our small ensemble version of it. What are some other things, Aileen, that we can do to set this up? Because one model that we could do is say, all right, friends, we're all doing centers. You have the directions at the centers, go.
Hmm.
And then you're like, well, center, I tried centers, Aileen, but they didn't work for me. So
Right.
can you help us, Aileen, like kind of set this up so that students
Yeah.
are successful? We're not tearing our hair up.
Yes. So there are a few different models that I've tried. If you have never done centers before and your students have never done centers, I would suggest starting with what I would call like a more traditional approach, which is 4 centers. And like I said, maybe at least a couple of them the students have done before because that really helps students be successful. And then you tell which students are at which centers, right? So,
Mm,
or you could have them choose, but I find it, especially if you haven't done it before, it's helpful to just say,
yes, for round one.
yes. And you
Yeah.
might do it where you're intentionally looking at the class list beforehand and deciding which students work well together, right?
Yep.
Or at my school, we've done like magic numbers where students know who is number one, who's number two, who's number three, right? So you could say, like,
Yeah.
let's say you have 24 students in your class. You could say, if your number is 1 through 6, go to this center. If your number is 7 through 12, go to this center, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how much time you have. But then after, let's say, 5 or so minutes, then you have students rotate to the next center. I have found something like wind chimes or like a tone chime,
Yep.
something that kind of cuts through the noise. Um, but is pretty,
Yeah.
is helpful for, or even just like playing a chord on the piano or something, some kind of signal. And you can tell students beforehand, when you hear me play this, I want everyone to stop. And at my school, we have like pause is kind of like, or you might have, they raise their hand or something. So when they hear that noise, they stop, they do whatever signal it is,
Mm-hmm.
and then you tell them which center to go to next. And usually it's, you're rotating clockwise or counterclockwise or whatever that might be. They spend 5 more minutes at the next center. You play the instrument again, they rotate again.
Yep.
That is really, I think, a helpful way to start centers because it's pretty structured, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I made the mistake of, I was teaching virtually during the 2020-2021 school year. And I had done lots of centers before that, and then we went virtual. And then I came back to in-person learning. And some of the students in my district were in person and some of them were virtual. So I was
Yeah.
teaching the virtual students, like half of the virtual students from the entire district. K-2 is what I was doing that year. And I came back and I thought, well, my students had me for several years before the one year they didn't, right? They remember how to do centers. I'm just going to do choice centers, which I'll explain how I do choice centers in just a minute. I'll do it. It's fine. And so I had a somewhat challenging fourth grade class. And I, explained the choice centers and I was like, okay, go. And then 30 seconds later, I realized it was a mistake. Like I should have done traditional centers, even though they've done centers plenty with me before.
Mm-hmm.
I should have done traditional centers to kind of set them up for success and remind them because it's been a while, right? So how I do choice centers is I'll set up 6 centers around the room. So you might have, the 4 categories that I gave you of centers fit a lot of different centers, right? But
Oh
not
yeah.
all centers. Like you might have a game center, you might have a listening center or something like that. Or if you're doing 6 centers, maybe you double up and you have 2 technology centers, depending on the technology you have in your room, right? Or you do 2 manipulative centers. It just depends. So I have 6 centers and I'll explain all 6 centers. And then I'll say to the students, you can choose which center to go to and you can choose when to switch.
Mm.
But you might have a few parameters. Like you might have, of the 6 centers that I'm explaining, I want you to go to at least 3 centers today. And a lot of the students will go to all 6, right? I
Mm.
have plenty of students that will say, oh, I did all 6. Or you could say like, everyone needs to do the worksheet center at some point today, or whatever that might be. Like if you have an assessment and you want all the students to do the assessment,
Yeah.
then you can do that. I've also set it up if for those people who use Seesaw. I feel like you have blogged about Seesaw, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So for people who use Seesaw or any other kind of like if you're just doing something like Pear Deck or something like that with technology that you want students to do, or a Google form or something like that. Then another way that I've done it, it's kind of like choice centers, but what I do is everyone starts with that technology center, right? Everyone starts with the seesaw activity or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And then after they are done with that activity, then they can choose whatever center to go to. So like let's say
Mm.
they finish the seesaw activity, they close up their Chromebook, hit the green check in seesaw, close up their Chromebook, and then go to whatever other center they want.
Yeah.
But I would not start with that because, like I said, students kind of need to be trained, even though in their classrooms, in the general ed classroom, they are very familiar, typically, what I
Yeah.
find, with centers. I think just doing it in a different context, they need a little bit of training to understand
Mm-hmm.
how you want them to do centers. So I would start with traditional and then maybe go with something a little bit more untraditional if you want to try that.
I love that approach of having everyone start with the same thing. And then just as they are ready to kind of branch off and kind of, one of the things that you said at the very top, Aileen, was like, this gives students more agency in their learning. And I wanted to circle back to that term because it's kind of like a buzzword, right? It was like a student
Mhm.
centered, student agency, like all of the exciting things that we say now, to show that we're really good teachers. But
Right.
what does that actually look like? And what you're describing with the student choice, and then also with them kind of going at their own pace, that
Yeah.
checks off so many boxes. That's so exciting just to think about. I do need to ask you though about classroom management with this because I know people will be like, Aileen, what world do you live in where your kids are just like floating around calmly and listening to wind chimes and doing these scenarios. And then the other kind of piece to that is in our efforts to give students more and more choice, we find that often the more choice we give, the more cooperation we get back from students. Also, if we give too much choice, then we get chaos. So I hear you kind of dance around these two kind of ideas. So can you give us some help with parameters for this
Yeah.
or classroom management things that we should be thinking about?
Yes. So, yeah, you do kind of have to think through some things, especially you might have some classes that are little bit more challenging or kiddos that may struggle a little bit more with this kind of
Mm-hmm.
free structure. That's why I think starting with the traditional centers helps because then you can kind of see, how it works for the students. But then when you're giving free choice, you could just have a consequence of if a student is not doing what they're supposed to, they're done with that center, right?
Mm,
Like let's say you have the interactive whiteboard set up with the squishy ball, and you have a student who's throwing it like they're playing baseball, right?
yep. Yep.
Um, and is getting into kids' faces and yelling or something like that, right?
Yep.
So then you can just say you have to go to another center. Like you can't do this anymore because you're showing me that you can't. You're having a hard time handling this. So I want
Yep.
you to go to another center. So there could just be a consequence. I think also like in the more traditional centers, um, telling students which centers to go to helps.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at the choice centers, I have done it where I just tell them choose, whichever center to go to, but you could give them a reminder of like, if you know that you have a hard time with your behavior when you're working with a particular peer in the class, then
Mm-hmm.
don't go to that center with them. Or if they do and they're having a hard time, then you can just tell them, why don't you go to that center instead
Mm-hmm.
and make sure you're not at the same center as so and so, right?
Yeah.
So they might need a little bit of guidance with that. But I find like I think some of the frustration that I have seen students have with traditional centers is that they maybe want to spend more time with a particular center and they can't because they were told they
Mm-hmm.
have to switch,
Yep.
or they're done 2 minutes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're just twiddling their thumbs, like, what do I do now? Right. So that's
Right.
the great thing about those choice centers is that they are able to choose when to switch. So I have found students overall are pretty well behaved because they're so excited about having that agency and choice.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the great thing about, centers in general is that unless you're anchored at a center, like in what I mean by anchored is let's say there's an assessment center and you
Right.
have to sit there and watch what the students are doing and take the assessment. unless you're anchored at a center, you really can walk around the room and check in on the behavior of students and really kind of monitor what's going on. So they
Mm-hmm.
might think that you're not seeing what they're doing, but because you're circulating, you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can pull that student aside and work with them one-on-one. So again, it takes a little bit of experimentation, and it's going to depend on which class, which students are in your class, how well it goes. But overall, I really have found behavior to be pretty good during centers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Aileen, it comes down to this like fundamental belief about kids that kids learn by doing, and kids want to learn if we're setting up the learning environment in a way that is, again, to use that phrase, student centered. Kids want to do music and kids want to learn new things. So if we can kind of take the responsibility off of us and put it on to students a little bit more, that suddenly frees up our own brain. And just to yes and something else that you were saying earlier about the teacher presence wandering around the room, kind of jumping in and helping and redirecting and I've done it before where for the assessment one, I set up an iPad and I just clicked go and just recorded students, doing whatever. And then I could kind of check in, circle in here, and here, and here. And there's obviously an added component. You don't save time that way because then you go back and you look through, but you can zoom through and say, like, I'm interested in this one specific student. How are we doing? So it's not a perfect system, but it's one way to kind of be two places at once.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't thought to do it like that. Yeah, I think like again, there are so many different ways that you can do it to save time, and I also think like as far as going back to classroom management and behavior, I also think that like students are so excited to get their hands on an instrument or get their
Yeah.
hands on an iPad, or I've used like spectrums, which is like this little ring that
Uh-huh.
will play different pitches depending on what color you're pressing, and the
Fun.
kids love that. You can get those on Amazon. It's like 2 rings for $50, so you don't even have to have a full class set. You could just get, let's say 6 rings, and then have enough for centers or whatever.
Yeah.
Or students, you could have 3, and students work in pairs. Or I've used like the Dash robot. There's a xylophone with the Dash.
Uh-huh.
I don't
Yeah.
think they're selling it anymore, which is such a bummer because it's so fun. But I've brought in like cool tech toys like that, and
Right.
students are just so excited to be playing with a tech toy, be playing with an instrument, be playing with an iPad. That often their behavior really is so much better. I had a couple classes this past year that just really struggled with behavior when we were in a whole group setting.
Yeah.
But then we would do centers, and the behavior was so much better because again, they have that agency, they have that choice, they're able to, make their own choices. So I think, again, we might be afraid to try something new, but you might be pleasantly surprised, especially if you have like a structure in place. You might be pleasantly surprised with how certain classes especially do with centers.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's hang out on this choice idea because I think that's probably pretty novel for teachers. If they haven't done centers at all, and then also the idea of kids just like kind of choosing their own centers. So let's camp out here. Two like logistics questions under the hood, so to speak. Number one, are people keeping track of the centers? Maybe if you care that they do something, then they might be keeping track, and maybe some days you don't care, and so
Right.
maybe they don't. So I'm interested in your opinion on that. And then, do you have parameters around how many students at one center at a time, or
Oh,
like
yeah.
avoiding
Sure.
traffic jams, or
Mhm.
anything like that?
Yeah. I have kept track before, but sometimes I haven't. It really just depends, if you're worried about behavior, that might be a good, or, worried about our students are just going to be staying at the same thing the whole time, even though you
Yeah.
told them to go to 3 different centers, right? Um, you definitely could. And I have like a little, you could just have a little checklist, center 1, center 2, center 3 kind of thing. And they're just
Yep.
checking off as they go.
Oh,
Just to
kids
keep
would
track.
love that, Aileen, to be like, I have done center 3, and now I am
Yeah.
on. Like,
And
yeah,
those kids that are like super motivated, like, I
yes,
did all 6.
yeah. Oh, yeah,
Right.
that's me.
Yep. And then as far as how many students at a center, yes, with some centers, you have to limit it because of the technology you have, or like
Sure.
like spectrums, for example, if you only have six spectrums, then you can't have more than six students unless they're pairing up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or instruments, especially like my Orff instruments, my Bard instruments are on wheels, which is really nice for just
Yeah.
able to move them out into the space. Um, and I have enough for a full class to play, really, but it would take up a lot of space. So it kind of depends on, I know some students will set up like a whole instrument section and all of the instruments are out, or maybe yours are on wheels like mine, or maybe you only have three xylophones, right? Like it
Yeah.
just really depends on what you have. So if let's say you only have six instruments out, then you can say, if you come over here and you see that all six instruments are being played, then just do another center until one is free and just kind of watch it. So kind of, I think is a good skill for them because it teaches them to be aware of their environment and to be mindful of, okay, I'm done with this now. Oh, an instrument, has opened up. I'm going to go ahead and play that instrument.
Yeah.
So, and you could make a rule like no more than X amount of students at any center, or it could depend on which centers your students are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Because again, it takes the responsibility for like managing every single effort that students do, and it takes it off of you, out of your brain onto them, because like kids are capable. Kids are like musical members of this community just like we are as the teacher, and like they can handle themselves if we are
Yeah.
scaffolding appropriately.
Yeah, and I haven't ever made a rule like no more than let's say six students can be at any center. I haven't done that. I've only done it for certain centers where I only have so many materials, and um, it does kind of put the responsibility more on them, which is nice because then you can facilitate more. You can, and here's another benefit of centers that I haven't talked about: being able to have one-on-one conversations with students is great because you might have like this past year I had like 750 students, right? And maybe there are some
Hmm.
of you out here listening who have over 1,000 students, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be really hard to have one-on-one conversations with students and really get to know them. But with centers, as they're walking around, you could say to a student, "Hey, how you doing today?" Right?
Hmm.
Or, "Hey, I heard on the announcements it's your birthday. Happy birthday," or whatever that might be. Or, "What are you doing this weekend?" Just
Yep.
being able to check in with students is really nice.
Yeah, I know so often we're looking for times to squeeze in like at the beginning of class or at the end of class or at lunch or whatever with certain students who just need a little bit extra attention from the adults in their lives, and we know that they need a little extra care from us because of how they handle themselves in the classroom. So I'm even imagining like an assessment section and an assessment center that you say like, for our assessment today, I'm going to say, how is soccer going? And we're just going to talk about how soccer is going, right? And like those are my minutes that I know I need to find with this kid to
Yeah.
make everything run a little bit smoother. But your point, Aileen, is that it frees up the teacher. The students have more agency, and the teacher actually has more agency with this model.
Yeah, it will feel a little bit different at first, right? Because you were so used to like having control of the classroom and we're doing this, then we're doing this, then we're doing this, and
Hmm.
and you're the one kind of leading everything, right? So this turns you more into a facilitator.
Yeah.
And it does, I remember the first time doing it kind of feeling like this, like, oh my gosh, like I don't have control. What's happening?
Uh-huh.
But then once you do it a few times, and the thing is like while you're doing it, it will feel like less work, honestly, because
Yeah.
you're facilitating, right? Now, on the front end of it, there might be more work as you're gathering materials, right? So the great thing about it is like the first time you do centers for, let's say, SoMe,
Hmm.
you'll have to gather all the materials, you'll have to print everything out. But then if you do, if you're intentional with your organization, um, I got these bins from Amazon that are like a little bit bigger than 8.5 by 11. So they're like 9 by 12 or something like
Yeah.
that. And then I put all of the centers material for SoMe into one container. And then the next time I do SoMe centers, I can just pull it right out. So you'll have a little bit more work on the front end, especially the first time you do that center. But then after that, it is a lot easier.
Well, and to add on to that, if you've done So and Me with your four rotations, or maybe year 6, depending on what your classroom management situation is. And we have those same buckets when we add in law, and then we have those same buckets when we add in Ray. Like, you're right that it does take a lot of work on the front end, but then throughout the rest of the year, and then progressively as we spiral up and up and up, it's like this is our time to sit and drink a cup of tea by the end of
Yeah.
it, you know.
Yeah, it definitely, yeah, you have that front end work, but then, and it's just different work. It's like, and to me, it feels more laid back and easygoing because then, yeah, I can have conversations with students. I can check in with students. I can explain one-on-one how to do something instead of trying to explain it to 25 students. I'm just explaining it to 1 or 2 students, right? If they need extra assistance or whatever that might be. So
Mhm.
yeah, it just, to me, it has a different feel. I love those centers days. Now, that being said, I wouldn't try to do centers like the entire day with every grade level because that would be like a lot of organization and a lot of like trying to remember where things are. But this past year, I did do it more where I would do like 2 grade levels at a time.
Yeah.
So I might have centers for 3rd and 4th grade, but everyone else is doing a more typical lesson, right?
Mhm.
And what I did when I did do it in the same rotation or the same week with students is I would, if I was doing rhythm, let's say I was doing Tickety for 3rd grade, then maybe I was doing Syncopa
Mhm.
for 4th grade. So they were both rhythm centers.
Yep.
And it just made it easier. Like I would do the same kind of center. I would just
Mhm.
swap out the files, right? It
Yes.
just, in my brain, it just made more sense. Like, oh, for this one, they're doing instruments. I just have to switch out the rhythm cards. For this one, they're doing the squishy ball game. I just have to switch out the file, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
For
Yep.
this one, they're, whatever. I'm just trying to think like maybe they're doing composing cards or something where they're creating their own composition and I just have to make sure that they have the cards that they need. So
Yeah.
it just organizational wise, and you could even like if you really were worried about organization, you could put this worksheet, the 3rd grade worksheet on pink paper and the 4th grade worksheet on
Yeah.
purple paper or something, just to help you kind of keep track of what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I like that that guidance about it doesn't have to be school wide, like right away, and it can save you some headache if you stack like maybe 2 grade levels, but it doesn't really save you headache if you stack all of the grade levels. And so with that, Aileen, how are you thinking about setting up stations for your kinders versus your second, third versus your fourth and fifth, or even people listening who teach, middle school? How are you managing what you're asking of students?
Yeah, so kindergarten centers will look a lot different, especially at the start of the year, than 2nd and 3rd grade. They just need um, more guidance, I would say. So I have had some, maybe I shouldn't call them failures because you learn from it, right? But I've had some lessons for kindergarten centers where I'm like, I'm not going to do that again. So you might try, I think something that is helpful for management, and especially for like your little ones, is instead of doing 4 centers at first, maybe just try 3,
Mm,
especially if you have a shorter time with them. So, like with my 1st through 5th graders, I have had them for 50 minutes, 50 minutes, which is a nice time for centers. I have done centers in a 35-minute lesson as well. It feels a little bit more rushed, but it is doable.
mm,
With my kindergarten, I only have them for 25 minutes.
yeah,
So centers is a little bit more challenging with 25 minutes, especially with kinders, right?
yeah,
So I have done 3 centers with them. And then that's just one less center that you have to explain and you can get through them quicker, right? So that has helped. So your question was like just managing, like what does kindergarten look like compared to 5th grade, compared to maybe middle school? Okay,
yeah.
so yeah, so like with kindergarten, I've done centers for like loud, quiet, fast, slow, like or comparatives or musical
Hmm.
opposites,
Hmm.
for steady beat, for rhythm, that kind of thing. And I typically don't start centers with kindergarten until maybe halfway through the year.
Yeah.
I found that, by then they know me pretty well. They know what to expect. They know
Hmm.
what music class looks like, and then we start trying it out. And of course, this is a personal decision, completely up to you. But that's usually I wait about halfway through the year. With my upper grades, I could definitely do it earlier, but I would have like at least a few lessons that are like more typical before I would try centers. And then, like I said, I would start with traditional centers. And then um, with grades 1 through 2, I've done rhythmic and melodic centers. With grades 3 and above, I have done rhythmic centers, melodic centers, or like instrument centers,
Mm.
right? So like ukulele, recorder, um, any other instrument that you might be playing. I've done centers that are kind of rotating around that. And I would think with I have done band centers too. So, like, let's say you teach
Oh,
beginning band or middle school band. Back when I
yeah.
taught beginning band, I did try centers for band, which was really fun. So, I would have like, I'm trying to think back now. I think I had one center where they were like practicing a piece that we were working on for a concert, right?
Mm.
You just had their instrument out and they were practicing. Maybe another center was like for note names, practicing, and I had like different, and I think I did have different color paper for this.
Yeah.
Um, they had different worksheets for this depending on what instrument they played. And then maybe another center was, sight reading a song, right?
Yeah.
So, and you could take those categories we talked about, like technology assessment, manipulatives, all that. You could take that and you could just apply it to anything, right? So you could apply that to band,
Mm-hmm.
or strings or anything
Yep.
like that. It
Yep.
totally works. Um, so yeah, it's noisy because especially with band instruments, right?
Uh-huh.
But again, the students feel a little bit freer. They get so
Mm-hmm.
excited on centers days. They really have seemed to enjoy that. And I often have students come back in the next lesson and say, "Are we doing centers today?"
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
if they see centers materials out for another grade level, "Are we doing centers today?" "Oh, I'm sorry, that's for third grade."
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, they definitely enjoy it. And again, this is not like a one size fits all kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can experiment and kind of see what works for you, but that's typically how I've structured it as far as concepts go for different grade levels.
Yeah, and I'm thinking just like with band or orchestra or choir, you have your station where people are practicing whatever it is, like performance piece that we're doing, and we have a station that we're doing sight reading. And then I'm even thinking that we can have a station if we have access to headphones where they're doing a listening activity and like some sort of identification thing, or even depending on what level you are working with, finding mistakes in the score in a performance, or like evaluating a previous performance, or something along those lines. Like this, I think this opens up a lot of doors, and even using those buckets that you gave us, like
Mhm.
the possibility is just start branching off, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, I think like just being a band kid myself,
Yeah.
um, I think sometimes we band directors, and I'll be able to dive more into this in my new role, but I
Yeah.
think band directors often we kind of get stuck in like, well, we have a performance coming up, so we need to practice. It's kind of like teaching to the test, right? We're
Yep.
teaching to the performance. But then there are all these other things that we're supposed to teach. And how do we do that when we have 60 kids in our band or 100
Mm-hmm.
kids in our band or whatever that is, right?
Yep.
So I think this does kind of free up, it allows you to teach those things or to touch upon those things that you've been wanting to,
Yep.
but in a way that still allows students to practice their music. And, yeah, like I said, it just has a different feel, but it's really effective.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay, so everyone listening is like, "Yes, she's speaking my language. I like all of this. This sounds awesome." You've given us some very concrete things that we can do, such as starting with 4, making it more teacher directed. You've given us our categories. You've talked about using activities, at least some activities that students have done before in the class ensemble before they do it in small groups. You've talked about making one of them an assessment so that we have like that connection point with all of our students. Anything else, Aileen, as we are like very excited to try this? Anything else that we should be kind of thinking about in the back of our heads?
I think just giving yourself grace. Like I said, don't expect it to be perfect the first time. And if your administrator does walk in while you're doing it the first time, just say to them, I'm experimenting. I'm trying something new. I think this will
Mm-hmm.
allow for more student choice and agency, and I think they'll probably buy into that.
Yeah.
Um, and Also asking for input from students. I have often asked students, like, what was your favorite center today? And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious. And then that gives you an idea of which centers to repeat, or maybe which centers like students didn't love so much, you know?
Uh-huh.
And you can just kind of observe that as well. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think just not try to not be afraid to just jump in and try it. And I think if you have some of those structures that we talked about today, um,
Mhm.
you'll have at least some success. And then, yeah, and then the things that you're like, oh, I won't do that or I won't do that. That's okay. That's part of the learning process, you know. And then just try to repeat more of what did work
Yeah.
uh, for whatever your situation is. If you have a small room, if you don't have very much time with your students, you know, you kind of, and here's another thing too, some other structures to think about that could be helpful if you do have, especially if you have a shorter amount of time or a smaller
Mm.
room, is play around with the number of centers, or maybe have some duplicate centers,
Yeah.
right? So maybe you have 4 centers, but centers 1 and 3 are the same thing, and centers 2 and 4 are the same thing, right? So you're really only doing 2 centers with the students on that day, but they're
Mhm.
split up into 2 groups for each center. That way you don't have a bunch of kids at the same center. So
Yeah.
you can be as creative as you want, depending on what your situation is, um, and kind of just experiment with that and see what works.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love it. I love it. So much flexibility and so much structure. I love it. Okay, so Aileen, this is something that you care about. This is something that you like talking about. And if people want to learn more from you, can you talk a little bit about your centers course?
Yes, I do have a centers course, and I should probably work on like opening that up as an evergreen thing, but I've launched it a few times a year, um, and that kind of walks you through like really, you know, if you really want more guidance and details about centers, um, you know, how to, like, I have a whole module all about technology, and I have a whole module all
Mm,
about assessment. So you really do like a deep dive into each type of center. And then it also comes with like a resource library that, like, if you're looking for, I need centers for law, then you
yeah.
go to the resource library, and here are 4 things, like boom, 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 boom. Here are 4 things that you can do.
Oh, I
Right.
bet people love that because you've
Yeah.
taken out so much of the guesswork, prep work in that.
Yes. Yeah. And I also, like I said, I have some centers freebie that I'll send you the link to. So if people want to sign up for that, then they have 4 centers right there that they can go ahead and try.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, Aileen, most people listening are probably very familiar with you and your work, but anyone listening who is not, we can find your centers course. Where else can we find you and hang out with you and keep learning from you?
Yeah, so I just changed the name of my business from Mrs. Miracle's Music Room to Aileen's Music Room, and that's Aileen, like Eileen with an A. So my website you can find at aileensmusicroom.com, and then on Instagram I'm at Aileen. It's at Aileen's underscore music underscore room, and I'm on TikTok at Aileen's Music Room. Yeah, so all the socials you can find me on, like Aileen's Music Room or Aileen Miracle. So yeah, and you can also send me an email at aileensmusicroom@yahoo.com as well if you have any questions.
Awesome.
And
Well,
I also
Aileen,
I have a podcast called The Music Room.
mm, excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for all of the work that you do for music teachers everywhere. And I know that you know, but just so that you've heard it today, the work you do and that it goes to music teachers, and then we send it out to all of our students. So the work you do is very, very impactful to lots and lots and lots and lots of people exponentially. So I'm very, very
Thank you
grateful
so
for
much.
all of the stuff that you pour into this work.
I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me on.